when President Trump is saying, oh, there's no issue with affordability, you're telling voters that what they see and they believe is wrong and that they're wrong and what they're seeing in their households is not the truth somehow. Hi guys, how are you?
Hey Katrina, hey Bernd, how's it going? Busy week again.
Always a busy week. How's it going, guys?
Good, and I've got a mince pie, so I'm very happy.
It
It's
is
the
that
small things.
the holiday season. I feel like it's the Christmas parties and for me the pumpkin pie that makes the season.
I thought pumpkin pie was Thanksgiving. Is that a Christmas thing as well?
It might be, but I eat it all through the season, so for
Same.
better for worse.
Yeah, what's not to love about pumpkin pie? But I suppose the thing about Christmas and holidays and all of that isn't for everyone. You're kind of counting out how many euro or pounds or dollars you have. It's all about the buzzword affordability that we just can't get away from here. President Trump calling it a hoax, in fact, the other day. So maybe as it's this time of year, we should just take a bit of a stock take on how this administration is handling all things economic and affordable, whether it's a hoax or it's a real concern. It's what everybody is talking about and accusing the president of not talking about.
And I think the timing of the year puts him in a particularly difficult spot in that, this conversation about affordably was lingering in the past, but the fact that it seems to have amplified around Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays and just makes it much more difficult and much more immediate for the White House.
Affordability really has become the buzzword, as you said, Katrina. And we've seen the president really shift, from calling it a con job, a hoax by the Democrats, to the White House now realizing that it is a term and an issue that they have to address. And that's why we saw the president go out to Pennsylvania, deliver that address there, although he spent not that much time talking about affordability, perhaps in a way that some of his allies would have liked. So on the one hand, it is an issue that they're aware of, but the messaging from the president has been really back and forth, hasn't it?
And I think a sign of the urgency of this for the president is, there was a recent podcast in which Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, said that she had essentially told Trump that he would have to campaign again like it's 2024. So I think, after the holiday period is over and he's back in DC in January, we'll see those sorts of trips like he did to Pennsylvania much, much more often. I think it's going to be a very different year in that regard, in that he hasn't really taken that many domestic public facing trips so far this year, but I think next year will be very, very, very different.
And the Republicans that I've been speaking to are actually in line nearly with the Democrats and the American people on this, in terms of they all think there's an issue with their economic messaging, that there's an issue with affordability. I mean, you just have to go to the supermarket or grocery store to see that. And what they're saying is when President Trump is saying, oh, there's no issue with affordability, you're telling voters that what they see and they believe is wrong and that they're wrong and what they're seeing in their households is not the truth somehow, when everybody knows how much money they have in their wallet and how much their groceries used to cost and how much they do cost this year and what they can afford for Christmas or the holiday season and what they can't. And there's a real big current, a big bubbling up, I think, within the party of saying to the president, you have to focus on this. This is not optional anymore. This has to become your big message and your big talking point.
I find it so interesting. I know we've said it here on the podcast before, and it's been said on so much analysis in the last few weeks, that it is so surprising to me to see the similarities between this point of the Trump administration and the Biden administration in that last year, where you had a president continuously, in a way, denying that there was an affordability or cost of living crisis. We were out on the campaign trails talking to voters who kept saying they were not happy with the way the economy was moving, with the way the country was going. And that was despite President Biden pointing to some of his hallmark policies and his legacy projects on infrastructure and bringing down costs, for example, of drugs. And yet people were not feeling that in their wallets. They weren't feeling it when they were going to the stores. That's the same thing that's happening now. And even though that message is being passed on to President Trump that he needs to accept it, we just saw him post on Truth Social this week, the stock market hit an all-time high. So when will the polls reflect that our economy is doing great? So again, the inability to reflect the message that people are actually feeling rather than that macroeconomic development.
And the president's certainly, I think, starting to feel how vulnerable he is with this particular issue. I was at the White House the other day and actually had a chance to ask him about affordability. And I thought his answer was quite instructive.
For whatever reason, and nobody's been able to give me an answer. When you win the presidency, you seem to lose the midterms, even if you win the presidency by a lot and you do a great job as president.
As you heard, the president's answer was kind of, to me, very indicative of how alarmed some people in the White House are, and that, you don't often hear him talk about the prospect of defeat or that something might not go his way in any regard. But, he explicitly said that despite, at no fault of his own, in his opinion, that the midterms might go badly for the Republican Party. And that's one of those rare admissions from his part that, this issue is one that might come back to haunt people. So he's kind of in an unenviable position of, as you mentioned, Sumi, being where Biden was last year, and that he has, perhaps not as much control over household good prices as he would have led people to believe when he was in the other position, running against a president.
I think as well, there's a realization that it's really, really hard to affect change in the economy, and it's really slow. And there can be a few years of lead time from policies to actually take effect. Certain policies, I mean, other policies which we're seeing the sharp end of quite quickly, of course, are the tariffs, right? And we can talk about those in a minute. But when we talk about affordability, President Trump sort of interprets that as inflation and says, oh, inflation is down, although it is rising. It's in and around 3% at the moment. But unless wages are rising in line with that or greater than that, affordability doesn't improve for people. They still can afford the same or less than they could this time last year. And, it also shows, and this is not unique to President Trump, right? It's politicians all around the world. People who don't do their own grocery shopping anymore don't know how much milk and bread and meat and petrol for your car and all of this kind of stuff costs. You're being told that by other people, whereas your voters and your supporters or your opposition know exactly how much all of that costs.
Yeah, our partners at CBS News have done some really interesting polling on this, and we were speaking to them this week about what the numbers show them. And their polling shows that 58% of people say that they feel prices are still going up, according to these polls. And if you look at, I put this question to our colleagues at CBS, who do people blame, let's say, or hold accountable for where the economy is right now, where the cost of goods, of living, where that responsibility lies. And they pointed to the fact that back in January of this year, more than half of the country was optimistic about the direction the economy might go, including on prices. And they looked at that number again around Thanksgiving, and that optimism was down to around 36%. And that's a really troubling number for the Trump administration, because what we continue to hear now, this pivot in messaging, is that this is Biden's economy that we're trying to fix. Not our fault. It is our predecessor's fault for, as they've said, ruining the economy. And it takes some time to get to a place where costs come down to a more sustainable level. And in fact, the New York Times pointed out that again, a sign that President Trump perhaps realizes or understands that there is a bit of an issue in that speech in Pennsylvania. You heard him mention President Biden's name, I think something like 30 times, which is something we hear him do when he feels like there's an issue that hasn't been addressed that he doesn't feel he should be held responsible for.
I thought one interesting kind of almost implicit admission that some of the administration's own policies had brought them to this point was there was also the $12 billion in farm aid that was announced by the White House, which is essentially, in their own words, kind of a bridge to keep farms being able to market their crops, for example,
I mean,
until
it's a bailout in normal
yeah.
speak. It's
You
a
know,
bailout.
and it was quite telling. I mean, they when they announced that, they specifically spoke mostly about soybean farmers and sorghum farmers, and their situation has been complicated very specifically by Trump's tariffs and the ongoing kind of trade negotiations with China, which is their greatest export market. So I mean, I think, even though they repeatedly blame Biden in that announcement, that's almost an implicit admission that the tariffs and the trade talks that the Trump administration has undertaken aren't kicking in quickly enough for some people, in this case, farmers, which, were broadly supportive of the president during the election last year.
And I think for farmers, it's multifaceted. I've been speaking to a few farmers on our shows this week, and they're being hit on all sides, especially on their input costs, right? So fertilizer way up because of the tariffs, particularly on fertilizer that's coming from Canada. Farm machinery costs way up as well for a whole host of different reasons to do with the tariffs. Then you have the impact on markets, particularly, as you're saying, Bernd, with China for soybean farmers and the trade wars that have broken out there. The other one, big one, of course, which that bailout this week was not intended for, but we'll see something happen for dairy farmers because of beef and the issues with the Brazilian market. So these farmers have said, that we've spoken to anyway, that this money will keep them afloat. Like they won't get through the spring without this help, this bailout package. They need that. But there's no suggestion that this $12 billion that's going to be given to these farmers will then be passed down the line to consumers in terms of trying to reduce prices or anything like that. And when President Trump was announcing this package, he said, were it not for the tariffs, we wouldn't be able to give this bridging payment. Well, the flip side of that, of course, is were it not for the tariffs, you probably wouldn't need that bridging payment because things have been made so much worse. And there doesn't seem to be any sense that this one-off payment, which farmers will find out by the end of December how much they're getting, and they'll get it by the end of February, according to the administration. What happens after that? I mean, there's no indication that that helps people other than to buy the things they need for the immediate next season.
And the president might have, complicated his own messaging with regards to the farmers, and that when he made the announcement, he said, strengthening American farms will reduce prices at the grocery store, for example. And if that doesn't happen within a relatively short time frame, I think we'll see that reflected in the polls, and that, he's now promised something, and then if he doesn't deliver, that's politically damaging to him.
And it just underlines again, I think, this frustration among some that the messaging that we're hearing from the administration isn't really necessarily in touch with what people are feeling. And there have been these concerns expressed even by Jerome Powell, for example, of this K-shaped economy, right, where you have the upper class, the really wealthy, kind of moving on an upward trajectory, the middle class facing shrinking economy that works in their favor. And then the poorer parts of the US of this economy are seeing their struggles amplified by these rising costs. And, something you said earlier, Katrina, that I think is important to say is, of course, President Trump, as he and his administration are pointing to his predecessor, Joe Biden, of course, there are aspects of these high costs that do indeed have legs and foundation well before President Trump took office again for the second term. One of the biggest drivers of costs for Americans is healthcare and also housing. And there's simply a lack of supply in both fields, especially housing, which, is an issue not just here in the US, but in many European cities and towns as well, right? And that is from a lack of building and housing, but it takes time to relieve that problem. And that's something that cities and states across this country are realizing as well, as they're trying to put into effect more building, for example, California, to try to reduce some of the regulation and permitting around building and making sure that there's more housing available so that the supply goes up. But the impact of that, you're not going to feel right away. And of course, for President Trump, that means that people might continue to see this as a massive problem while he's still president.
And of course, the problem with housing costs is that also many of the input costs for housing are going up because of the tariffs as well. Many of those building materials are really expensive, not unique to the US. As you say, Sumi, there's really serious housing crises right across Europe, and it's very similar. It's to do with supply, and it's to do with the cost of the building materials and supply chain issues, which are there from the Russian invasion into Ukraine, which are still a hangover from various other kind of geopolitical elements over the last few years that it's really hard for people to get a handle on. But it doesn't look like improving anytime soon. I mean, you look at the statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, grocery prices are up 2.7% year on year. Electricity costs are up more than 5%. The Social Security Administration said in the last week or so that its payments next year will go up by 2.8%. Well, if inflation is 3%, and your social security payment to the least well off, the most vulnerable people, is going up by an amount lower than inflation, the pure maths on that mean that things aren't going to get better for those people. Their affordability is not going to improve either.
I think the main problem for the White House here is, these are all long-term problems, but there is a ticking clock because of the midterms coming up next year, and that if there's no improvement there, I mean, time is very much on the side of the Democrats here, and we've already seen Democrats with affordability messaging do very, overperform in many elections, and they've notched a few wins, most recently in Miami and in Georgia, for example. So I think the fact that this is a long-term problem puts the White House in a very awkward situation, and that there's really no short-term solution to this that would satisfy people probably before the midterms come around, which 10 months is not a very long time. 11 months, however long it is, it'll happen very quickly.
So the Republican strategists I've been speaking to, their answer to this is wait for President Trump's policies to take effect. For example, tax cuts from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, some of the policies like no taxes on tips, that when people start to see these policies actually take hold and have an impact, that Americans will start to feel much better about their purchasing power, about prices that still may remain a bit higher than perhaps the administration want them to be. But the problem there is what is really the question of whether enough Americans in the right sector of the economy are going to feel the impact, because we know, of course, those tax cuts also benefit wealthier Americans who are not feeling the squeeze as much as those who don't have as much purchasing power.
And I mean, we've seen that in the elections this week, haven't we, in Miami and Georgia, and the elections we've seen actually all year. Speaking to one Democratic strategist, they said there are now more than 20 races, statewide races in the US this year where Democrats have flipped Republican-held seats or in areas that Donald Trump did really well. So they're kind of almost giddy with excitement and anticipation for next year about, what may happen along the way, whether they can keep riding that train. And, it's all about timing in election cycles, isn't it? If there was an election next week, probably the Democrats are going to do really well and roll over a whole pile of seats. But it's a long road to get to polling day next year and what will happen then. And I was also speaking to Rahm Emanuel this week, who very famous in the Democratic Party, of course, former mayor of Chicago, former chief of staff to Barack Obama, former US ambassador to Japan, and someone who has not ruled out a run at the presidency himself. And he said there's 3 reasons why Democrats are doing so well. Number one, people are really angry at President Trump and how he's governing. Secondly, he keeps telling them, oh, there's nothing to see here with the economy. You're all wrong. It's a hoax, as we were discussing earlier. And that really annoys people as well. And he said, thirdly, Democrats are really energized. And, we see that in midterms all the time, don't we, with the party who's out of power. But they've had these few bumps along the way, positive bumps along the way, that they're kind of getting into a groove now. And they feel like they've hit the lane, housing being one, cost of living, transportation, infrastructure, all of these, really pocketbook, kitchen table sort of issues.
I think the White House is to a large degree counting on, President Trump essentially being on the ballot in all those local races. And this will really be the ultimate test of whether he still has that kind of sway over the party, and that, he's not actually running for anything. They're counting on his word to kind of sway the races one way or another. And so far, it hasn't done that. In Miami, for example, the president and Governor DeSantis endorsed someone else in the race, and that candidate ultimately lost. So I think this, perhaps more than anything else that has happened this year, is really a test of his continued hold over the Republican base rather than just Republican lawmakers that are already in office.
And a question of whether they want to put President Trump on the ballot, which his chief of staff says. Usually the president is not on the ballot in midterm elections, but they see President Trump as having incredible drawing power among his MAGA base, among Republicans on a whole. But if his policies are seen as creating higher costs of living, with the inflationary impact of tariffs that we've been talking about, then maybe you don't want him on the ballot. I think the question for Democrats really will be, and I've heard this from so many members of Congress I've spoken to and strategists, they have to have an argument for how they would bring down the cost of living, not simply pointing to the president as being the cause of why the cost of living is still too high, but have an actual solution for it. And as of now, I think the messaging around that hasn't really been cemented, crystallized. We've heard different approaches, the abundance economy on building housing, or the more left-wing progressive approaches that we've seen from Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But that's going to be key for them to be able to really pick up seats in the midterms.
I think as well, there's a sense among some of President Trump's supporters that last year in 2024, he was like, I'll fix the economy, I'll make it better, and didn't necessarily offer a play-by-play list of how he was going to do that. So people who took a punt and trusted him maybe will be less likely to do so in the midterms, because kind of once bitten, twice shy, and they may want to see, to your point, Sumi, a bit more structure and a bit more detail as to how that will actually happen. And, if the figures continue in the way they have been going, the economic indicators, the economy may be in even a much worse position by this time next year.
We've often spoken about how polarized the country is, but I think this shows that there really is more swing to the broader electorate than I think many people discuss openly, and that, the people aren't actually divided on this particular issue, which makes it almost very unique in things that have happened so far this year from the White House. I think this is something that people are generally in agreement with, that prices are too high, which, really presents a very, very serious challenge for President Trump.
I did see one poll from Reuters Ipsos that said that showed that as Republicans and President Trump have started to embrace a bit more the affordability messaging, his favorability ratings were ticking up slightly. So could very well be that we see the president, hit the road for a number of events like the one that he held in Pennsylvania to reach out to Americans. And likely, as you guys have both said, we are going to see him do so. And that can turn the tide a little bit, particularly if we do see some of those costs come down, some tax breaks take effect where Americans feel like they're under a little bit less pressure. So that remains to be seen, whether President Trump can really turn the narrative on the question of the economy and affordability. But they seem to be quite confident that he can.
For him, it's going to be a challenge. He can't be in permanent campaign mode like he was last year, because now, of course, he's in the White House governing, and this is all, campaigning takes a lot of time, that now his time is divided. And I don't think the White House has really articulated how it'll manage to balance those things. I mean, there's a reason presidents don't often take to the road in the midterms, because it's an enormous task. And now he has to do that, plus the enormous tasks he's already doing from the Oval Office every day. I think that's going to pose just kind of a logistical and energy challenge almost.
And when you're talking about polling, Sumi, there was a Harvard Caps Harris poll out this week, which said the top two issues that voters right now is the most important are inflation and the economy, followed then by healthcare. No mention of immigration, which was such a big issue last year. So in a way, the president has kind of, I guess, been a victim of his own success, you could say, because he has, through all of his policies, and of course, many of them controversial and before the courts as we speak, but the number of people crossing into the country without the correct paperwork is way, way, way down. So now that's not an issue that voters are indicating to pollsters, at least, that's of concern for him. So no indication that this issue is going away anytime soon for him.
That means we'll be talking about it for weeks to come, I'm sure.
And months and years. But we are out of time for today, so no more talking about it for now. Burns, you've got a dash to the White House.
I do. I will. Always a pleasure. I'll see you guys very soon.
See you soon.
Okay, bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. So do leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.